This episode is part of a series where I take already published memoir and break down what works and why, and what doesn't work and why. I found that when I'm teaching my memoir method concepts to my writers, they benefit from seeing how these principles play out in a memoir that you can already find at the bookstore. This month, I'm looking at the memoir Sociopath by Patric Gagne. You can find part 1 of this month's breakdown back in episode 83. You are listening to the Memoir Method podcast, the place for writers, readers, and anyone who appreciates the collective power of our stories. In this podcast, we explore the impact of memoir alongside an examination of writing techniques and strategies used in the genre. Whether you are a writer looking for inspiration and guidance or a passionate reader seeking meaningful connections through shared experiences, the Memoir Method podcast is your go-to conversation spot. I'm your host, Charlotte, editor, writer, and the heart behind Charlotte Writes. Let's get started. So in this part 2 of Sociopath, I really want to go into the narrative devices that Patric uses to have the conversation that Sociopath is here to have. In part 1, we broke down her memoir's foundation and really looked at why the combination of her focused reader and message is so effective. And we really dialed into the conversation that Patric is here to have with her story. In part 2 of this breakdown, we're going to go into how she actually has this conversation within the book. One of the things that I really paid attention to that really stuck out to me as a reader and as an editor was how Patric uses emotion, or the lack of it, in her story. The primary characteristic of a sociopath is that they do not feel emotions the same way that regular people do, or non-sociopaths. An emotion is such a key theme of the book. We are looking at the emotions of other people, Patric's emotions, the way that she experiences emotion or not, and what that actually means. We're looking for the meaning behind emotion. And so that's a major theme of the book that she amplifies in a few different ways. The biggest way that I noticed, and I thought that this was genius, her interactions with other people show the varied ways that Patric comes to understand how she is actually wired. She takes different relationships and interactions with people in her life, and each one kind of shows a different emotional response that this person would have to Patric. And it's almost like this mirror. So she sees all these different ways that people respond to her to figure out who she is. And I'll go into how this actually plays out in a narrative arc in a minute, but I want to go into some of these relationships that she examines in her memoir. So we have her relationship with her mom. There is actually a lot of fear that is present from her mom that Patric observes and witnesses. There is her friend and eventual spouse, David, who has a lot of acceptance. She's very surprised by how David interacts with her. There is her friend, Mike, who shows a lot of curiosity with her sociopathy and how she engages with the world. He has some of that acceptance that David has, but he's very curious about it, and he kind of likes to play with it. And then we have a few different friends or coworkers that we see throughout the pages who are very exploitative with Patric's sociopathy. And so we kind of see how she responds to being used by other people. And then we have much more of a professional interest in her psychology, and we get that from her therapist. Those are kind of the ones that came to mind when I was going through this book, the ones that stood out to me the most, because each of these relationships show us something different about Patric. They help her learn more about herself, but it also helps the reader learn more about Patric, because she does not quite know how to describe herself, and she doesn't know how to interact with other people in a way that to her would feel objectively normal. But so we see all of these different relationships play out, and we see them each have a different thread that runs through them, and each one shows you how Patric is slowly developing her own sense of self and her own place within a sociopathy diagnosis. Patric uses the interactions that she has with other people to illustrate how she develops her relationship with herself, because that's really the arc of this memoir. And I want to talk about that. So not all memoir needs to begin in childhood. In fact, I often advise against that when working with one-on-one clients. I usually say, hey, let's start the book here way more down the road, and then we'll pull in your childhood as backstory when relevant. Patric starts her memoir in her childhood, and in this case, it's very, very appropriate. It really works. So we begin in her childhood when she starts to realize that she is fundamentally different from the other kids around her, and we follow her into adulthood, where she continues to navigate life as a diagnosed sociopath, trying to fit in and also not be a bad or dangerous person. And even once she kind of drops that need to fit in or be accepted, there's always this fear that she has that she is actually bad or dangerous. She is putting a moral meaning onto her personality, and that is tricky. And that's also really a deep part of the conversation that she's here to have. And so the way that Patric uses other people to help understand herself better in the context of this memoir is very skillfully done, because it's really tricky to write about other people in memoir. Yes, you need to treat them like characters in a narrative, because that's what they are. They're also real people. And real people are usually more complicated than a character in a novel. Sometimes Patric uses pseudonyms, but not always. That's kind of a separate conversation we can have another time about how to write about other people. I'm going to go really deep into how to write other people when I teach phase 2 of the Memoir Method starting tomorrow, actually. So if that's something that you really need some guidance on, you want to hop in there. I'm really excited about teaching that. In the case of Sociopath, the author uses other people to amplify what is happening in her inner world, because she does not know how to connect with other people, and so she's bridging this gap by showing us all of these different ties that she has to other people, and it amplifies what is actually going on inside. So it's almost like she uses the emotions of others to better understand her own, or lack thereof. And she uses these relationships with other people to help the reader understand Patric's own difficulties inside of the primary plot. Something else that I want to highlight in Sociopath, and how Patric amplifies this conversation that we articulated back in part 1 of this episode series, is how she threads in her authority as a conversation starter. We see 2 versions of Patric in this book. We see her character, which starts in childhood, and her as the narrator or authority of the story. All memoir needs both versions of you as the author. All memoir needs this latter version of the author, this narrator version especially, to guide the reader through the story. The reader needs to know that the character is going to end up okay, and the narrator version of the author actually gets to dip in every now and then to remind the reader that, yes, I know that character me is being a pill, but don't worry, I've got this. There's a real authority that's going to reassure the reader when stuff feels unknown or out of control or even a little scary. Without that, in Sociopath, the reader would probably worry that, oh my gosh, is this going to end with her killing someone? Is this going to end with her being locked up in a psych ward? But because we have narrator Patric pulling us through and asserting her authority as the storyteller and as the conversation starter, she is assuring us, hey, this is going to work out somehow. Just trust me. Resolution in memoir can be hard to find sometimes, especially if there's not a defined happily ever after, and we can't really make it up because it's memoir, right? But that is why tapping into who you are right now as the authority of the conversation is so important. Sociopath doesn't have the same kind of tidy conclusion that readers often want, and sometimes memoir can deliver that. Sociopath doesn't have that exactly, but Patric is the clear authority here, and she leaves the reader satisfied with where character Patric ends up. Patric is able to execute this balance and this thread and these themes because, 1, she knows her conversation, and 2, she knows when to thread through her authority as a storyteller, as the narrator. That balance is so essential. She does this by sharing research, statistics, and studies on psychology and sociopathy. Her own experience as a sociopath gives her credibility and authority for her ideal reader, which, as we established in part 1, is a fellow sociopath. And her career as a researcher and a PhD give her even more credibility and authority in the context of her conversation. She's able to leverage all of this while still staying connected to her reader. This does not feel like an academic work. It feels like a story, and it feels like one that is led with authority. I never felt lost. I never felt unsure or unmoored. I was like, okay, she's taking us somewhere. I don't know where she's taking us, but I trust her to do it. When you think about who Patric's ideal reader is, other sociopaths, this authority that she has is especially important because this reader needs to know if they're going to be okay. Because if they can see that Patric ends up okay, then they can believe that they can be okay too. Sociopath was a fascinating read that is such a conversation starter. And it starts a conversation that I didn't even know existed, which is even more exciting to see as an editor and just as a consumer. But Patric leads the conversation with a confidence that assures the reader she knows what she's talking about, while still being vulnerable about her own life and experiences. As someone who does not experience the world the same way others around her do, she has felt very othered throughout her life, but she uses these narrative techniques, these interactions with other people, and her authority as a sociopath to bring this conversation to the reader in a way that is really accessible, in a way that is really provocative, and in a way that is actually very invitational and almost emotional, which is ironic given that she does not experience emotion the same way that most other people do. As we close out this part 2, I want you to go into writing your own memoir, remembering a couple things. 1, name the conversation, like we talked about in part 1 of this series. And then 2, use the narrative devices available to you to amplify that conversation. Patric used relationships with other people. She used her other characters to amplify that conversation, which was a genius move with a memoir with this focus and for this reader and with this conversation. There are so many narrative devices available to you that you can use to amplify your own memoir. What I cover today in part 2 of this sociopath deep dive is actually all covered in phase 2 of my Memoir Method program. And good news for you is that, like I mentioned earlier, phase 2 actually kicks off live tomorrow. You can head off to the show notes to enroll. What I love about doing this Why It Works or Not series is that I am taking all of the principles from the Memoir Method program and proving to you that this works in any memoir. This works with any memoir that you could pick up. So if it can work in a memoir like Sociopath, you can apply all of these principles to yours to create a memoir that is compelling, that is attracting the perfect readers, that is starting an ongoing conversation that you could talk about all day. That is what the Memoir Method teaches you how to do. And what is so much fun about this series is that you can see how it plays out. And so now you get to start thinking about how it gets to play out in your writing. That is what I teach inside the Memoir Method. We are just skimming the surface in these podcast episodes, but the actual program, that is where the depth is. And I really cannot wait to see you inside and to have that conversation with you there, to see you grow as a writer and to see you take all of these principles and apply it to your existing manuscript. Because once you do, that is where your entire career as an author, this is where your book is getting into the published zone. This is where everything for you changes as a writer and as an author. So check the link in the show notes for that to enroll. Again, I start phase 2 tomorrow. Phase 1 is all ready for you to binge, and I will see you there. You've just listened to an episode of the Memoir Method podcast. The Memoir Method podcast is presented by Charlotte Writes. If you liked what you heard, the best way to support the show is to subscribe through your preferred podcast player. And if you're feeling especially inspired, I'd love it if you left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Leaving a review really does help other readers and writers like yourself find the show. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find me on my website at charlottewrites.co or on Instagram at charlottejanewrites. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next time. And remember that you have a story that matters.